Welcome to the regrettably delayed episode of Veritas Voices, focusing on the argument we all know and loathe, Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about you, the most frequent version of this I hear is just a quick and very reactive, but what if you're wrong? Is that what you hear?
Uh, Typically, when Pascal's wager is presented, it's presented in an informal way. And well, if I'm wrong, then nothing happens to me. I'll just stand. It'll be over. But if you're wrong, then you're headed to hell, my friend.
Oh, so
That's
they
usually
actually
what
give
they
you the
say.
full rundown. I have to
Yeah.
wonder. I actually was really, when I was thinking about how different our experiences have been, I was really wondering, when did you first hear this argument? Because I know in Germany, most people are not that religious. Like even Christians tend to be generally a lot more chill.
Yeah. Pretty much when I first heard that argument, I was sort of starting on my way and caring about the God debate, and I was following a few atheist YouTubers like the Amazing Atheist and or Jacqueline Glenn, and pretty much the first time I ever heard of the argument was within a video of Jacqueline Glenn, and I wasn't an atheist at that point, but I agreed pretty much with all of her points. And even then, when I still was a deist, I recognized, well, that is one bad argument.
It is indeed. I mean, I've had several people point out to me how cowardly it is, and that's always been my first objection. Like,
Yeah.
seriously? Y- Seriously, that's who you want to be, the groveling supplicant to something that might not even be there?
What what I think is the worst part about the argument is it isn't even an argument for God. It is an argument for trying to force yourself to believe that there's a God.
Yeah.
And personally, if I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced, and I'm not going to pretend to be convinced, because if there's a God, and if it's a Christian God especially, then he's gonna know that I'm not convinced. He's gonna know that I try to convince myself. And if I was God and I had a person who was trying to fool himself into believing in me, if he was genuinely convinced that I wasn't real, then I would be even more pissed.
Yeah, no, true. I mean, it does reek of hypocrisy and cowardice in many different ways. But
Yeah,
I was just thinking because, I mean, the whole what if you're wrong, subtle or not so subtle threat of hell, I'm sure that was used as a argument. I say that very loosely before Pascal. But Pascal, when he formalized the argument, advised people to simply go through the acts of faith, go through, go to mass and take the sacraments and pray and just sort of do all the things by rote, and faith will come to you.
yeah,
Um, so he was advocating not for any kind of, rationally convincing yourself of something, but for basically fake it till you make it.
yeah.
Um, which that's not creepy. Uh, but it's something I noticed in my experience that a lot of people will say, like you said, if I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced. Like I can't choose what I believe.
Yeah.
And the thing is, that's true for honest people.
Yeah.
But we've discussed my indoctrination before, and I was taught ways to choose what I believed. I was trained in mental habits that I could use to reinforce a belief that were not honest. But I mean, I didn't know when I was learning them at 6. I was just taught that I absolutely had to do this, and so, I did because I
Yeah.
was 6. So it's kind of funny because you can choose what you believe if you're willing to lie to yourself and make believe really hard to the point where you're like self hypnotizing yourself,
Yeah,
which I can say from experience is awful. Don't do that.
yeah. I mean, that's also one thing which I often get on Twitter, which I feel is kind of related to that. Sometimes atheists just often tell me, well, just ask God, just get on your knees, ask Jesus to reveal yourself to you. And I just wonder, what is the point? I mean, if God is real, if Jesus is real, he knows damn well that I cannot say this in a genuine way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he knows that I'm utterly convinced that this is all foolishness. And once I tried, if I were to try that, which I would never do, but if I were to try that, I would, at every point of time, or at every point of time when I go through the process, think to myself, this is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, you'd be sitting internally rolling your eyes,
Yeah,
which I get. And the thing is, if God was real and if that worked, it wouldn't matter if you were rolling your eyes internally. He could still do something, come forward, be like, I know you thought this was stupid, but here I am, blah, 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 reasons. But every time you tell them, actually, I did pray and actually God didn't do anything, then they'll tell you it's because you weren't sincere. And
which we
so,
cannot be.
exactly, like I can sincerely want to know the truth about the thing, at which I always do, but I can't sincerely believe. Basically, what it's like, what they're saying is, if you believe, then you'll believe.
Yeah,
Because I know when people try to share their experiences of God with me, I don't know. I find it very difficult. Have you had people? Are you okay?
yeah, I am completely.
Okay. Sorry. Have you had people try to share like personal experiences of Jesus with you?
I have heard many conversion stories from theists, and I usually read them. And pretty much what it boils down to is that they somehow had the spiritual experience. They somehow Jesus enlightened them. They had some sort of grandiose experience, some form of grandiose feeling, and
Mm-hmm.
that convinced them that Christianity is true, that Jesus is real. But one thing which I want to add to that is that I also think that atheists can also have this experience, or can have
Mm-hmm.
experiences that are grandiose, that we just feel this overwhelming awesomeness, this overwhelming, whatever you can describe it. I actually did also feel that, have some sort of feeling like that when I was in Africa, when I was on holiday in Kenya. But the difference is that we do not attribute it to a Holy Spirit or anything of that sort.
Yeah. Oh, you were in Kenya? That sounds beautiful.
I was a
I'm
child, but
so
that's not the topic.
jealous. I know, but I'm still jealous. I've only ever seen giraffes in a zoo. What can I say? North America is far away, and well, these things happen. But yeah, I guess the other thing that it hinges on, well, it hinges on a couple of things, but the biggest and most obvious is hell.
Yeah,
I learned about hell at a disturbingly young age. Granted, they weren't too explicit with hell, but eternal bad place is still pretty clearly terrifying when you're a child. And they couldn't exactly keep me from noticing any of the cultural references to fire. So I wonder, I mean, you say you grew up as a deist with sort of a general, there's something out there. Uh, when did you hear of hell?
I, to be honest, I really don't remember, because I also grew up as an atheist. I do think that the first time I really heard of hell was probably in school in a religion class, but it's not something that was taught to me by my parents or by anybody else. I just picked it up along the way within my education.
Do you remember the first time you spoke to someone who actually believed hell was real?
uh, to be honest, I don't really know if I am outside of my internet life ever met anyone who actually believes in hell, because in Germany we aren't really that outspoken about religion. And okay, no, that's not true. I do know that some people within my life have believed in hell, but it was a sort of Catholic school teacher which I had in school. But she did believe in hell, but she also believed that no one is going there
Oh, okay. So
because
it, like,
God was making it open to everyone to go to heaven.
okay, so it's the hell was just for the devil and his
Yeah,
buddies.
she
Okay.
was what one would call, I think, a universalist.
Oh, yes, yes, I know Universalists. My dad has actually become a Universalist. Part of the reason that I've forgiven my parents so much for my indoctrination is that a lot of the worst of it happened when I was very young, which is an unfortunate coincidence for me because those were formative years. But they were manipulated and they've been moving away from the extremism ever since then. And now my dad is a universalist. My mom isn't a universalist per se, but she's a lot more open-minded. I think she
Yeah,
probably only thinks that really terrible people go to hell, or
yeah,
she stopped thinking about it because it's too painful. But
yeah,
like Hitler or,
yeah.
you know, Stalin, honestly, if they
But
were in hell, I don't think too many people would be too upset.
yeah, but I think universalism is also sort of a great point to bring up, because it also ties into Pascal's wager in order to stick to the topic. Because if universalism is true, then all of a sudden all the odds are just relevant. Because if I don't believe in God, I still go to heaven. If you believe in God, you also go to heaven. So at that point, the wager is pretty much debunked. It wouldn't matter either way.
Yeah.
And the same holds because within Pascal's wager, we part of the argument assumes a total place of ignorance, right? We don't know if
Mm-hmm.
God is real. We don't know which God is real. It could all be possible,
Well,
but
yeah, that's another point, the idea of other gods. I know Pascal tried to come up with some excuses to sort of wave off, well, mostly Islam, because that was the only other major religion he was sort of
familiar with.
aware of, but because the Moors, but that's that's it pretty much, and the Jews because they didn't accept Jesus. So he tried to come up with excuses to sort of brush those off and then just focus on Christianity, which probably worked in his time. He was, you know, writing to a Christian empire.
Yeah, and also the argument is for a Christian audience, and so Christians, in my experience, have a hard time, for instance, imagining that there might be a God out there who is totally different from our God. Like, let's say there's a God, but it's not their God. It's a God who deliberately put us on Earth and made himself hidden, and wanted to figure out who was aware that he didn't leave enough evidence, and who was at that point skeptical enough to not buy into religion. And that would pretty much imply that God right now loves atheists and he isn't too fond of all those gullible Christians, which could,
Especially the extremist ones. Oh, I
yeah,
saw the most hilarious series of pictures on Twitter this morning, and it was it was a sequence of shots. One was a news story, Category 5 Dorian is approaching, and there's a news story. And then there was a bunch of Christians rebuking Dorian in the name of Jesus, and they had a picture of them all with their hands raised on the beach. And then it upgraded to a Category 5, and a picture was taken from the International Space Station, zooming in on the hurricane, and there was this huge eye of the storm, and the entire eye of the storm was a rainbow
yeah,
circled around. And I was like, it looks like God's on the gay people's side. Maybe you guys need to take a sign.
yeah.
But yeah, what's your favorite response to Pascal's wager? What do you use?
Well, favorite response, pretty much, it's a sort of funny response. My favorite response is asking them right back, well, or proposing this scenario that maybe they might be wrong and that they are wrong about the Christian God and that Jesus was not really God incarnate as they currently believe, but actually Satan incarnate, which would mean that they are literally devil worshippers, which means they would be worse off than everybody else on this planet.
Yeah, they would. It's impossible for them to consider it. I realize that, but yet at the same time,
Yeah,
how would they know if they were being deceived? Like, that's the
yeah,
point, is you don't know if you're being deceived because
yeah.
you're being deceived.
I mean, that's sort of my tongue-in-cheek response in a sense, but I also sometimes often I also go the route of actually being genuine and actually entertaining the thought that I really might be wrong and that I am on Judgment Day standing before a God.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, because I am willing to consider that option, I'm not really open to the Christian God because I think that one is incoherent, but it could be the case that there's some form of theistic God. And at that, and if I stand before that God, then I would just ask him, okay, what did I miss? Why couldn't I figure this out? And I would have probably a long conversation with him where I talk with him about all kinds of stuff like why is there suffering? Why was he hidden? Why all these questions that have bothered me and all these things, or why are there so many different holy books which contradict each other? If you're a good
Mm-hmm.
God, why wouldn't you make sure that we don't have these books,
Mm-hmm.
which would cause general or great confusion to the entire planet? So I would have a lot of stuff to talk to him about, but I can also imagine that if this God cares about me and if this God knows who I am and knows what led me to my atheism and that I wasn't trying to close my eyes intentionally, I cannot help but think that such a God, or really any God in general, would in some sense be proud of me that I had my own mind, that I had my own brain, that I did really try to think about it, and while I did reach a conclusion that he would deem wrong, I do think that he would see my efforts and he would be proud that that I actually tried and that I was honest in my pursuit
That you acted
for
with
truth, but
integrity.
that I was honest in my pursuit of truth, but
Mm-hmm.
that I unfortunately did not find it.
Right. Well, and acting with integrity is, I mean, that's the thing that really gets to me because they say you have nothing to lose. I've lived as a Christian. I can assure you, you have a damn good sight to lose. And not just, a day every week and potentially 10% of your income for as long as you live, but
Yeah,
if you really take it seriously, you have to subject your moral and intellectual integrity to doctrine. I mean,
yeah,
that's what can a man give in exchange for his soul? That's it. If we could be said to have a soul, even in a metaphorical sense, surely that would be it. And
yeah.
that's, you're literally giving up everything that makes you worthwhile, that makes you a person you can look at in the mirror and respect, on the off chance that maybe something very improbable is true and you don't want to be tortured.
That is also a great point, and that is also one answer which I frequently give when they say that they have nothing to lose. You have pretty much everything to lose. You have to lose potential bonds or potential relationships which you could have had, but which your doctrine prevented you potentially from having. You have to lose a life which you could have lived without the fear of hell and without a hope of a non-existent heaven. You have lost a great many things. You have pretty much, if you all if 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 it boils down to it, or if you really think about it, you have to lose what could have been the life you could have had you not adhered to this doctrine.
It's true. And I know, see, there's this thing that a lot of people, um, I guess, don't really understand about the way Christians think, because there's this default assumption in them that God is good and God is love. So if I'm following God, I must be living my best life.
Yeah,
And we can see very well why their doctrines do not demonstrate that, and their behavior very much doesn't demonstrate that. Um, they're, statistically, they are often worse on many metrics, especially evangelicals or Catholics who take their faith seriously, the ones who really care.
well, are
Um,
those true Christians?
you aren't my flavors, so you're fake. Yeah,
Yeah,
all ice cream flavors are fake except for mint chocolate chip because that's my favorite, so all the others are not real ice cream.
yeah, but go on. Yeah,
But one thing I realized coming out of religion, and this was a really big realization for me, and I realized that very few people ever see this because they're either too close or too far away. And just in the moving away, I got right to that point of close enough and far enough out to see it. That in the mind of every believer, there are two gods that they think are one. Now, the first is the God of their doctrine. That's the God that you and I argue about because that's the only God we could know anything about. If you
yeah,
say you're a Calvinist, the God of predestination is an evil son of a bitch. I can argue about that.
yeah,
Even if you say you're a Christian, I may not be correct in all my assumptions, but I can assume a few basic doctrines and I'm probably going to be right, and we can talk about that. But that's not the God they have the emotional attachment to. Prior to that, it's really the first thing that they were made to believe about God, usually, or the prime thing, if not the first, is that God is good and God is love. And then their view of what that means, of what good means, of what love means, that becomes their attachment. That's what they are viscerally defending. So it feels to them that they are defending their personal identity, their integrity, all good and right and loving things in the world, even when simultaneously they are literally arguing for why the genocide of the Amalekites was right. And that's how you can have these wildly contradictory positions, is because someone has managed to get them to take these two concepts and believe that they are the same thing, despite the fact that they are very evidently not the same thing if you take two steps back.
yeah.
And so they will think that they're, on some level, they will viscerally feel that they are defending morality and justice while they defend the worst atrocities known to man.
Yeah. I mean, that's also one thing which really bothers me about Pascal's wage, because if you're raised to believe that, then I think you're really inconsistent to even propose Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
Because if you're led to believe that God is love and that God is justice, and if you have this fundamentalist belief in a God, then you do not actually consider the option that this God might not exist. So you're being hypocritical if you ask, what if you're wrong, if you cannot honestly entertain the idea that you could be wrong yourself? Because Pascal's wager, as far as I'm concerned, is a two-way street, right? You can you can ask Pascal's wager to an atheist, but you also at the same time, if you are going to propose Pascal's wager and if you are going to take the argument seriously, then you would also have to consider the possibility of the consequences if you are wrong.
Yeah.
And they do not ever do that.
No, no. And that's, I think, I want people to understand why they feel like they can't. because the psychological blocks are making them do these strange and twisted things in their brain already. So they're already basically, it's like someone in some kind of weird yoga pretzel, and you're like, just grab that cookie. It's like half a foot away from you, but they've got their heel up over their head, and they're, doing so they can't, even though if they weren't in a ridiculous position, it would be the easiest and most reasonable thing in the world. And they'll literally die of hunger rather than unpretzel themselves and reach over half a foot. So I'm not saying it's a sensible position. I'm saying I understand it because I understand sort of the effects of some of the manipulations, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's, it's funny though, the point of integrity, when I first heard Pascal's wager laid out, because I obviously had already been terrified of hell, and then I was told I couldn't love God just because I wanted to escape hell. So then I had to manipulate myself into some weird Stockholm syndrome. No, I just love you for you, really. And I did as sincerely as anyone can in those circumstances. But when I was a teenager and they were trying to, get us to reach out to other teenagers, there was a video presentation that was given, which laid it out, didn't mention Pascal, but did have, this young, hippish looking youth pastor guy be like, what if you bet on this side? Then if you lose nothing. If you lose everything. Or you can gain everything or gain nothing. And I remember saying out loud, yeah, that totally makes sense. But inside, I was thinking, wait, no, that's wrong. You're not supposed to, for one, you're not supposed to love God just to get out of hell. And two, that's not honest.
Yeah.
And I think it's very telling that even inside myself, I knew that that was wrong and messed up. And yet, I didn't feel like I could say that out loud, in part because if anyone heard my doubts, maybe I might prevent them from getting saved because it would lead them in the other direction. So I felt the need to affirm the idea, even though in my head, I thought it was bullshit.
I mean, that I think you brought up two great points there. Point number one is the Bible quite clearly affirms that, and I think this First Timothy 2:4, that God wants to have a genuine relationship with everyone. He wants everyone to come to know the truth, and sort of just going safe and to take the bet and just to believe for the heck of it is not really a genuine relationship. It's a fake relationship. It's convincing yourself into believing that. That's not what the God of the Bible would want of you, if he existed, which he doesn't.
Fair.
And the second point, it's just not honest. It's not a good way to find the truth. It's cowardice.
You're right, it is cowardice. And it bothers me all those times that I thought something was wrong and didn't feel empowered to say it, especially in an outreach situation. I remember as a kid reading Chick tracts. I actually read a lot of them as a kid because I knew someone who had a big stack. And when one of them was wrong or weird, or, well, I mean, they were all weird, but especially weird, I said something to my mother and she said, yeah, they're not perfect, but lots of people have got saved because of them. And it sort of communicated to me the idea that you really shouldn't criticize something too much if it's a way that people will get saved, especially not out loud.
I think that's also a great point because, I mean, I'm just going to say it. I think most, or at least many of the people who actually use Pascal's wager know it's a bad argument, but they just hope that they can find an atheist who hasn't heard of it and that they can try to help somebody get saved. I also think this goes for the vast majority of apologetic arguments, but if this argument helps people get saved, then it's an argument that they are going to use. I mean,
Yeah.
the apologist or the presentator of the argument, which you brought up earlier, I'm very certain that he was also aware of the rebuttals of the argument, but I also strongly suspect that he didn't give you the rebuttals of the argument or the responses.
Oh, good Lord, no. No, this was a very simplistic view. You have to understand, as a teenager, I was very zealous for God and I went to lots of youth retreats and stuff, but it was all very simplistic because partly because the idea was you had to get your friends saved. And this is actually disturbing when I look back at it. There was a youth minister who told us, literally explicitly laid out, that if a person doesn't get saved by the time they're 18, there's only like a 4% chance they'll become a Christian. Like even if they get saved first and then maybe they walk away and have a time of struggle, they'll sometimes often come back. But of Christians, most Christians make that first commitment at least before they're 18. And he said this, and I understood this as we have to get to them now before it's too late. Because at the time, I was a younger teenager. You know, I don't know if I was 14 or 15, but you know, I was not. But the looking back at it and seeing this does not work on the consenting adult mind. So we have to get as many children who have not fully developed as possible in the doors as quickly as we can.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at it now as an adult and you go, holy shit. That's you're grooming children and manipulating them. And they literally knew. I mean, he said clearly, if you don't get your friends saved by the time they're 18, there's very little chance they will ever know the Lord. To me, at that time, of course, it meant that if I didn't get them saved or help someone else get them saved, because I never really had any evangelical gifts, or if I in any way prevented them from getting saved, then before they were 18, then they would probably go to hell.
Yeah. Which is a horrible thing to say, but it's also, I actually believe that this is the case. Like, I do believe that statistic, because oftentimes when I hear Pascal's wager, when I hear various arguments, because I watch also some apologetic videos, I also watch some videos of atheists where they sort of offer critiques, and I mean, we're all familiar with these arguments, and if you actually know both sides of the argument, then the Kalam is not going to be convincing, fine-tuning is not going to be convincing, and Pascal's wedge is also not going to be convincing, because we know these rebuttals, we know where these arguments fall short.
It's
But
true.
but when you give, but the people who use the arguments, what they are trying to do, in my opinion at least, is find the one person who is not familiar with the argument and then use it and then try to get people saved that way. And this is gonna be especially effective for children,
Yeah.
or at least people under 18.
There's a desperation to evangelizing people, a get them in the door as quickly as you can and we'll sort them out later. Um, it's, you know, it's funny. One of the ex-evangelical hashtags that started recently, um, it was started by a conversation between Dr. Stroop and a young man, I think, who is still an evangelical, but you can tell doesn't like it and probably the mind is struggling to free itself. And he said that a pastor had told him or had been mentioned in a sermon one time that the church was like the ark, you know, Noah's ark with
Yeah,
all the, you know, it's crowded and it's kind of shitty, but if you get out, you'll drown. And that led to the hashtag jump the ark. Because like literally get out, just jump out. You're not going to drown. We're all fine. Um, And I don't know what effect it had on the person who originally said that. I hope it helps them get out. But it is very much like that. It's like people all crowded on a tiny boat screaming at us to get out of the way, that we're all drowning, but we're not drowning. Like, and every time it rains, even just a little bit, they panic hysterically and try and drag us in. And it's like, no, it's spring. Rain comes at this time. Calm down. And we're all going about our lives. They're like, you're drowning, you're drowning. And we're like, no, we're going to a dinner party and it's perfectly dry. What are you on about? And eventually you just start walking around further and avoiding them because they're acting insane. And the flood never comes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, bit of a tangent there, but it's very sad to me to think of living that way, to remember living with that sort of constant sense of tension and anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I never was there, but it must be really difficult.
Oh yeah, it totally sucks. You know what I like though?
What?
I like that the best rebuttal to Pascal's wager came centuries before he wrote it down, at least in my
Really?
opinion. Yeah. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Live a good life. If there are gods and they are just, they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods, but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but you will have lived a noble life and will live on in the memories of your loved ones."
I think that is a great quote, and it's infinitely true, right? If there's a God and he sends people to hell, I would want nothing to do with him. I do not care if God, in that sense, would be good or would be love or would be the standard of justice. If God is the standard of justice, I don't want to be just.
Yeah,
But he's
not
not.
that version. Yeah, I know, it's a horrible attempt to define words into their opposites just to get them to stick to a religious view. And it's
Yeah,
again, it's the way that people sacrifice their intellectual and moral integrity just to
yeah,
stay in a shitty, shitty boat.
yeah. Which is also one thing which I have watched sort of a video today by an evangelist who talked about Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29, and he tried to say that the passage with the 50 shekels of silver wasn't actually describing rape. And he was going there to, I think, the KJV version, where it doesn't explicitly say rape, and he brought up all kinds of bad apologetics to say that it was actually for fornication instead of rape. So,
Even though it
these,
literally says it in other versions. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
and even though it was the, the whole sort of in context, the whole chapter was pretty much about rape and about laws about rape. And in Hebrew, the word that was used there that he thought was fornication is actually a pretty violent word, which would seem to indicate that it is rape. But
Yes,
that's
violent
also,
fornication. That sounds right.
yeah,
Ugh.
but that also I think ties into Pascal's wager that probably he is aware of this. I mean, if he cares about the Bible, which he thinks to be the Word of God, then he is aware of this, but he lies to himself about it. He lies to others about it purposefully just to make believe and just go to heaven,
Well,
which
that's
has nothing to do with integrity and which I think any just God or any God who cares about truth would be ashamed of.
I would certainly hope so. Any God I would respect would certainly be ashamed of that behavior. But it's like I said, it's those two gods and trying to force them together, trying to make yourself believe that they're one God is, I mean, it creates huge cognitive dissonance, which is very painful, but then you can tell yourself that that pain is the presence of God. And then that becomes an experience that you can use to reinforce your faith. And then depending on whether you value decency more or a kind of literalist, brutal honesty, you either become liberal or you become, hyper evangelical conservative.
Yeah. Or also that this pain is a sort of test of God, or that this pain is sort of the pain of doubt, and that you have to blend it out completely right now because doubt is a sin and you cannot reconsider it. That's a vicious circle.
It is. It is. And it's very much like, it's very much doublethink,
Yeah.
1984, you know?
And that's also the amazing thing about Pascal's wages, because they use this argument while believing that doubt is a sin, but Pascal's wager, the argument itself is sort of the proposition to doubt. What if you're wrong?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they
Yeah,
think doubt is a sin, but at the same time they use an argument that is dependent on doubt.
it's true. And I mean, granted, it's intended to persuade someone who's doubting, um, because, doubt can be forgiven as long as you overcome it with faith.
Well, of course, doubt in the proposition of God is a sin, but doubt in the proposition of Allah, well, that's virtuous because special pleading.
It's funny, one of my mentors as a young adult told me a bit of a poem by, I believe it was actually a Muslim poet, who said, doubt is a pain too great to know that faith is his twin brother. And there are people who reach what's called spiritual maturity. I think it's just to some degree, personal maturity and also a little bit of empathy, who realize that you can't get past a very infantile idea of God if you never face doubt. And those people, they may have kept me from going crazy. They also may have kept me in the faith longer than I needed to be. But they were good people trying to make this work. And they did empathize with me. They did say, yeah, it's not as simple as if you don't feel God, guess who moved. Sometimes you don't feel God and it's not because you did something wrong. And sometimes you doubt and it's not because you're evil. And that was a really good thing for me to hear. I certainly needed to hear it at that time. I had a lot of fears and it helped to work me out of this just blank terror of doing or thinking or saying anything wrong. But, and their more flexible, mature view of God was one that I could work with, I guess, a little bit more as an almost functional person. So it's, even within Christianity, it's not always as simple as the blank wager. There are people who understand that life is a little more complex than that. But I still think the fundamental idea that faith is a virtue is just really, 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 really wrong. And that
Yeah,
part needs to go away.
yeah. Though obviously many will also, if it fits them, say that atheists have way more faith than Christians, and at that point, of course, faith is not a virtue anymore. Right.
Right, of course. If we don't have faith, then faith is a virtue. And if we have faith, even though we don't, but they tell us we do, then it's a vice.
Yeah.
And
And in the
consistency,
case of and in the case
consistency
of
is not a strong point there.
yeah, in the case of Pascal's wager, when you should actively try to have faith and you work towards that, it's pretty much make yourself delude yourself into believe in God. Just try to make it, even though that is dishonest, and even though that is not what Christianity or the Christian God would want from you, or pretty much any being that has any sort of honesty at all.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also the implicit admission in there that the reasoning is not good enough to convince you. And I spent years and years looking at apologetics because I really wanted my faith to be justified. But even as a Christian, even as someone who was raised in the faith, I could see it was enough to keep me in. It made my faith feel not totally irrational. It was enough to
Yeah,
keep me where I was, but it wouldn't have been enough to talk me in from the outside. And I knew that. And I kept
yeah,
thinking I just didn't understand enough. And if I kept looking, and I kept searching and reasoning, I would eventually get to the place where I would understand enough that I would have been able to move myself into it from outside.
yeah,
And yeah, that was my faith, my
yeah,
exercise of faith, and I completely regret it because faith is not a virtue.
yeah. But I think with apologetics, I think apologetics can in many cases also be harmful
Oh yeah.
because if you are a Christian who has done apologetics and who's going out there, then you are eventually going to run into an atheist who's going to demolish those arguments. And if your faith is built on apologetics, then your faith will weaken
Hmm.
if you find out that those arguments are debunked. So, say if I was a Christian, then the last thing I would recommend is doing apologetics. I would just say, believe, believe, believe.
Hmm.
Don't base your faith on evidence. Don't base it on science. Don't base it on anything else. Just believe in it, because if the science changes, then your faith may crumble.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you're right. The good news or the bad news is that they don't really base it on apologetics. Apologetics is there as a bolster,
As a
to
tool for evangelism,
as a tool
exactly.
for evangelism that doesn't work. But what the real role of apologetics is, because let's face it, it's never convinced anyone who wasn't already in an emotionally vulnerable state of the
Is to
reasonableness of any of this.
is to keep people in the faith, I
It's to keep
suspect.
them in, absolutely, but it's a bolster. It's never the foundation itself. Reality keeps washing away the dirt from under faith, and apologetics comes in as a prop, and you stick enough sticks in, and even if they're not very good, you keep hoping that if you keep enough sticks in place, it'll prop it up and it won't collapse. And I mean, it's an admission on some level that, you know, we have to go through all of these gymnastics to try and convince people we're right. And I've never known the apologetics to actually convince someone who was genuinely unconvinced. I
Yeah,
maybe a few people who like doubted but really wanted it to be true, maybe, but I can't see it going any farther than that.
yeah.
Anyway, well, I feel like I've covered all my points on Pascal's wager. How about you?
Well, I think I've also said pretty much all the important things. So,
Yeah. Well, I think we can wrap it up then. And honestly, your first point was best made by Homer Simpson with, but Marge, what if we're worshiping the wrong God and every Sunday we just make him madder? Which is, yeah, that's one of my favorite little cartoon moments of Homer Simpson because
yeah,
even an adult like him can understand that argument and it's actually still good.
yeah. But that's exactly what Pascal's wager. That's exactly why Pascal's wager would also deadly be for the Christian, were he to honestly consider it.
Yeah, true. True, true, true. But everyone wants to think their ideas are special without actually justifying it. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
Anyway, I guess that wraps it up for our first pre recorded episode of Veritas Voices. So that's awesome.
yeah.
Thanks for everything, Renee, and the chat. I had lots of fun. I
It
can't
was a
wait to see what
pleasure.
people say.
It was a pleasure talking with you, Lilith, and I'm looking forward to future episodes.
Me too. All right. Talk to you again soon. I
Yeah.
can't wait to hear what people say. Bye bye.
Yeah.